Here at REEF Environmental Education Foundation. Key Largo is our home base, has been for over 30 years now. It's from here that we do our global work toward marine conservation by equipping regular people to count fish and contribute to science so we can understand fish populations and marine conservation. We're delighted to have you here for our Fish and Friends evening. I have a couple of announcements, more than a couple, I'm not going to lie. There's quite a few announcements. So bear with me, and then we'll get our speaker, Brad, up here just as soon as we can. So the first one, upcoming programs here with REEF, these are 2 virtual programs. Our book club, how many people are in the book club in this room? Just a few people, okay. It's a Zoom book club. It's amazing. Every time there's a new book, there's a different book about fish mostly, and we almost always have the author talk to our group specially. So it's a great way to connect with other people around the country and the world who love reading about fish and the authors. Then on the 31st is a Fish-and-R. This is another online program where we go with experts kind of into more detail about fish ID. And the topic for this one is common fish of the Mediterranean. There's a whole library of recorded Fish-and-Rs, so wherever you're gonna go in the world scuba diving, including here, if you wanna know more about the fish, check out those Fish-and-Rs. It's the month of July. That means it's Great Annual Fish Count. I always wanna call it Great American Fish Count, but it's not. It's Great Annual Fish Count. And this is kind of a month of citizen science around the country to get people involved in citizen science and counting fish. And there's a number of events being held with local dive operators here in the Keys. But on Sunday, something very special, a group is going to Blue Heron Bridge up in West Palm Beach and doing the dive there, which has got a ton of amazing sea creatures that you don't see anywhere else. So it's a chance to go with people who know how to point things out to you. And Pura Vida Divers is our local partner up there. So there's more information about all the Great Annual Fish Count on this yellow slip of paper on your chair. And you can also talk to Sierra, who's in the red shirt there, to talk about that. Okay. Lionfish is one of the things that we're known for here at REEF. One of the things we learn from counting fish is when we see fish that don't belong here, like lionfish, and learning how to identify, collect them, and safely get them off of our precious reef. So there's some information here on August 12th and 14th. This is in the run-up to our Lionfish Derby and Festival, which is in mid-August. We get teams from around the state that come and compete with each other for taking lionfish off the reef. I think there's a prize for the smallest, a prize for the biggest, a prize for the most. It's really a lot of fun. And there's, did I skip it? There's going to be a celebration of lionfish awareness because beer is fun. Invaders on Tap is the name of the event. And we're going to be talking about fish. There's going to be music and games and things like that. That'll be in Isla Mirada. If you've been around in years past, we've had this event at Postcard Inn, and they're not quite open yet for business. So this is our new location for the celebration part of our Lionfish Derby weekend in August. Now, next announcement, I was talking to some folks about this earlier. One of our innovative new research projects to help recreational divers contribute to science in marine conservation is called the SMILE project. Basically, we take a TG6 camera with a laser on the top of it, just like you see here, and take a picture of target species. These right now in this stage of the project are fish that are commercially important, groupers, snappers, parrotfish, those kind of things. So you need to have a little bit of an experience as a diver, but not really anything about data collection or photography. And if you're interested in that, you can talk to Mead back there in the yellow shirt. He's been on a lot of these, and Carolyn's not in here right now, but we've got staff who are going out regularly on these dives to do this, and it's a lot of fun. So if you want to contribute to our citizen science in that way, please do. Next, post-event survey, that is on your chair also. These surveys are really important to us as a nonprofit organization whose funding and support depends on our ability to reach people in a meaningful way. And the way that we know that it's meaningful is when we get data from surveys like this. So I know sometimes surveys are a drag, but it would be awesome if you could pick up the piece of paper before you leave. I'll remind you again at the end and help us out with that information. I want to say thank you to our volunteers. We've got David Hartman back there as usual, helping us with the audio visual. And Nancy's out there with the food, and Marta, and then we've got a whole team of volunteers here helping put this evening on. So we're very thankful to them. Before I go to community announcements, I want to make one remark that this is the last Fish and Friends for one of our dear staff people, Madeline Mussey Moose. Do you want to stand up? If you don't know Moose, I feel sorry for you because she's amazing. She started here at REEF as an intern and has really grown into a wonderful asset, both to the organization, to our Keys community here, and to the whole cause of marine conservation. She's a fantastic educator, speaker, organizer, and I can't wait to see where she goes next and what she does. So everybody can join me in roasting her. Do you want to make a speech?
Thank you to all of you in the REEF community. I mean, this is my first job out of college, and I've stayed for 5.5 years, so that speaks magnitude for how great it is. And part of what makes it so great is all of you guys in the community we have here. So thank you all for making this my home.
Are there any announcements about other marine conservation related things? Bob?
At the History of Diving Museum next Wednesday, which is July 17th at 7 o'clock, is our monthly free presentation, free to everyone. And it's a great one. Matt Lawrence, the archaeologist, if you don't know him, for the sanctuary, and Noah is presenting on the HMS Lou, and you can probably figure out where it wrecked.
Okay, great. Thank you. Anything else? Super. Down at the bottom is a QR code for our newsletter. We have a special email newsletter that just goes to people here in the Florida Keys community. So that's a great way to stay in touch in addition to our newsletter. This is my last slide, I promise, Brad. I wanted just to say that funding for this program is provided through a grant from the Florida Humanities. And these funds, as I mentioned, nonprofit organizations like ours are very thankful and grateful for the public sector funding that we get. We work hard to compete with others to get these awards and are very proud of them, and hope that others in the state of Florida and elsewhere will continue to invest in communities like ours. Now, with no further ado, the person that you've been waiting here to see, Brad Bertelli, Florida Keys historian, author, speaker. I don't know if you're like me, you have one of his books in your guest room. You know, I have the Key Largo history book in our guest room. I'm sorry I didn't bring it to get you to sign it, but it's just a thrill to have you here, and I'm just going to turn it straight over to you.
Thank you so much. How's it sound? Okay, Mead? Cool. All right. Thanks so much for coming out. I'm looking forward to talking. Sharing a little bit of Florida Keys history, some local history, some super local history for REEF here. If you haven't found my Facebook group, please do yourself a favor. It's Florida Keys History with Brad Bertelli. I do a post every day, share some information, some photographs. The discussions are amazing. And I'm going to start with this picture. For anyone who knows me, Indian Key is my favorite island in all the Florida Keys, and this will make sense in a second, or several minutes. Why I chose this. This was a sketch done by Dr. J.B. Holder about 1859. Between 1859 and 1860, he took a round trip voyage from Fort Myers to Miami and back again, and did a lot of observations about the Florida Keys, a lot of sketches, wrote a lot about what he saw. And those stories were published in Harper's Weekly, Harper's Bazaar. And this is how Indian Key looked about 1860. I know some people think that the island kind of evaporated after the attack in 1840, but it was still a really popular rendezvous and a very popular place to live. And I'll talk a little bit about the population size a little later on. But I'll come back to Dr. Holder and his sketches which will become much more in tune with the rest of our discussion. And what we're going to talk about is Rock Harbor. This is Rock Harbor. We're going to talk about some pineapples, talk about the Albury family, or one of the Albury families, and its connection to REEF and this location in particular. I always like to, whenever I talk about Rock Harbor, I always like to include this slide because of the way they have chosen to spell rock. This is the only place that they use the English version or the British version of spelling Rock Harbor, and so I always like to include that because everywhere else it's Harbor. But here we go. So Rock Harbor, famous for its pineapples. Once upon a time. And the Florida Keys pineapple industry began just on this ground right where we are right now. And we're going to talk a lot about how that came about. And that was all due to a man named Captain Ben Baker. And he was from Green Turtle Cay in the Bahamas, like most of the early pioneers came over from the Bahamas in the Key West and then branched out. So in 1850, he was a 32-year-old mariner, lived in a 2-story house on the corner of Whitehead and Caroline Streets. And he was in charge of the Baker Wrecking Company. And he had his ship, the 13-ton, 3-masted schooner Rapid. And unlike a lot of the wreckers, his ship was a little larger and able to do a little bit more, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Now, one of the cool, we don't get a lot, there are no photographs of Ben Baker. This is just a sketch that was done. And what he did, well, we know a little bit about him. There's a book called The Key West, the Old and New, that was done in 1912 by Jefferson B. Brown, who gives the only description that we know of Captain Baker. Tall, gaunt, shrill-voiced, hook-nosed, hawk-eyed. He was master wrecker at nearly every wreck upon the reef. And when we talk about wreckers, a lot of people equate them with pirates. They were kind of doing the same thing. And the wrecking industry they were really the first responders of their day. There was no Coast Guard. There was nobody out there, looking to help people. There was no Army. There was no or Navy. There was no Coast Guard. There's nobody out there looking to help people, except for the wreckers, who were out there for business, sailing at first light up and down the reef, because in those days the early bird gets the worm, and that first wrecker on site became known as the wreck master. And the wreck master was a really important role to have. If you were the wreck master, you got to decide how the salvage operation was done, who got to work it, and more importantly, who didn't get to work it. For instance, if we're playing cards on Wednesday night, and I'm with Jill, and I'm with Christina, and I'm with Dan, and we're playing cards, and I catch Dan and Christina cheating, and then on the next morning, we all show up on a shipwreck, and I'm the first one there. I'm the wreck master. I get to decide who gets to help me and who goes home at the end of that day. Christina, you're not working. Dan, you're not working. Jill, you're making the money. It also helped that the wreck master, because you're the first one there and got to plan, you also got the biggest portion of the salvage claim. Now, another misconception about wrecking is that you didn't just show up and just take command and do what you wanted to do. You were licensed by the territory, by the government. So you saw a ship that was in need of help. You approached the ship, presented your license, and offered the master of the wrecked ship, do you need my assistance? And because it cost a lot of money to accept that assistance, sometimes the master of the wrecked ship would do what they could to get themselves out of their predicament. And sometimes that just meant waiting for the next high tide to come in, float them off the reef, and be on their way. Unless, of course, you're there, you're taking on water, you're on your side, and you need help right then you're kind of at the mercy of the wrecker. And early in the early years of the territory, 1820, 1821, 1823, It was kind of a Wild West situation out there. And sometimes those salvage fees were 75% or 95% of the value of the ship and the cargo that was on there. And you had 3 jobs as a wrecker: save the people, save the ship, and save the cargo if you could. And for that effort, you were paid a percentage of the value of the ship if it was saved, and the cargo. For the people, you were just doing a good job. Now, for Ben Baker, he was considered the king of the Florida wreckers. And during the 1860s and 1870s, he was considered the king of the Florida wreckers. Between 1862 and 1880, he was involved in 41 salvage operations, and 15 times he was the wreck master. And when his family would ask him, how do you find all these wrecks? How are you always the first one? And his response to his family was always, we wreckers can smell them. And with that big hook nose, it probably helped a little bit as well. Now, this is another sketch from Dr. J.B. Holder. And this is a sketch done right in this area here of a pineapple farm that was in development in 1859. And the thing about wrecking it wasn't full-time work. So most of the wreckers had side gigs: turtling, fishing, and in the case of Captain Ben Baker, farming. So about 1858, he and his sons got aboard the Rapid, sailed to Havana, picked up about 6,000 baby pineapple suckers and slips, little baby plants that grow on the side of your pineapple, and then came up to this area, mile marker 97, mile marker 98, cleared the land, and they clear the land, and then they would like cut and slash and then burn the trees and the brush, and that would help to add a little bit of extra soil or loam to the ground. And then they planted all of these pineapples, and this was a sketch that Dr. J.B. Holder did of Captain Ben Baker's pineapple farm here in the Rock Harbor area. Now, he also had another pineapple farm on Plantation Key, which is one of the reasons why Plantation Key is called Plantation Key.
Are these on the bay side or the ocean?
Ocean side, because in your big sailing vessel, you know how hard it is even for a skiff, to navigate these waters. And we're talking big sailing ships with rudders who need extra water. So most of it was always on the bay side. All the early developments, I'm sorry, on the ocean side. I'm pointing that side, the bay side, that side. That's why a lot of these early communities were here on the ocean side and built on the water, facing the water, because you had no mosquito control, you had no air conditioning, and what you wanted to do was have all those windows open up to allow that whatever breeze is coming in to mitigate some of the heat and some of the biting mosquitoes and no-see-ums and whatever else is coming in. Now, for pineapple farming, again, this is 1860. And then so in Harper's, whoa, it's all right. How dare you? I'm using Jill's computer. I hit the little scroll button there. So in Harper's Weekly, when it was published in 1871, Mr. Baker, the owner who resides in Key West, is reported to have realized $7,000 this summer from his crop of pineapples. That's $7,000 in 1870. That's almost $250,000 in today's money. Not too shabby for a side gig. Now, one of the things that the Baker did as well, he opened the very first post office on what was not really Key Largo yet, but Key Largo. And he established it June 14th, 1870. He, on his postal application, said he was servicing about 17 families. Now, those weren't all people who lived here necessarily, but also mariners who were coming in to collect, who were working out on the reef and coming in to collect mail. It was short-lived. and closed on October 10th, 1871. But just to give you kind of an idea of what was going on in 1870, in all of the Upper Keys, Key Largo to Lower Matecumbe, total population about 133 people according to the US Census. Indian Key, 1870, 46 people. That was the second largest community in the Florida Keys. I'm sorry, in the Upper Keys. Upper Matecumbe Key, today the heart of Islamorada, 13 people. 11 Russells and 2 Sands, or I'm sorry, 2 Saunders. And then Umbrella Key, that's Winley Key. Used to be 2 islands. One of them called the Umbrella Key. And then when Flagler came, filled in and made it 1. And then Plantation Key had 9 people. Now on Key Largo, the largest of the islands of all the Florida Keys, 61 people, 13 houses. 3 of the people on the census were lighthouse workers. 8 were seamen who were fishermen or just working out in the ocean. 10 were farmers. Farming, what people don't realize about the Florida Keys, especially the Upper Keys, these were all farming communities. Those would come later. Yeah. Farm labor, 1 farm laborer. Mostly the early big cash crop, pineapples. And once upon a time, nearly all the pineapples that were eaten in the U.S. and New York and Boston and Philadelphia, all grown here in the Florida Keys. Now, one of the cool stories about Baker, when he would sit around his table at night with his family, he would talk about watching this great suspension bridge being built in New York. Because unlike a lot of the wreckers, once you got your crops, once you got them plucked, crated, and ready to ship to market, you had 2 options. You could send them to Key West, sail them down to Key West, where they were put on big ships taken up the East Coast markets. And for every trip, about 25% of your crops would spoil at sea. Sometimes if there was no wind or if there was bad weather, you would lose the entire crop for the season, would spoil at sea. But one of the things that was really cool about Baker with his ship, the Rapid, he was able to get his own fruits together and take them up to New York on his own schooner. And he watched the Brooklyn Bridge being built and would sit around the table at his home and tell his kids about this great, I love these guys right here. That's a great picture. And it's also, I mean, that's New York City in 1870, 1880. Such a huge difference to what, the pioneer people trying to brave this reality down here in the Florida Keys. But so one day in July 1889, Captain Baker was around the table having dinner, maybe talking about his experience with the Brooklyn Bridge or watching that being built. And about 7 o'clock, he starts to feel ill. And 4 hours later, he was dead.
Was that here?
Yes, that was here up across the street, basically. And after he died, his sons broke apart one of the skiffs to build a coffin. And they lined it with some brown linen that was used to make underwear and other clothing for the family. And they put Captain Baker's body into the casket and went to sail him home to Key West to be with his family and buried in Key West, but there was no wind. So they had to, no, it's okay. It was all outdoors. They had to come back, and he was buried here in Rock Harbor, somewhere about mile marker 97. And there was as late as like 1910, his marker could still be seen in the fields. Yeah, it's long since gone. Now, the next slide is kind of embarrassing for me. You guys have heard Baker's Cay? It took me a shockingly long time to put two and two together. Baker's Cay was called Baker's Cay in honor of Captain Ben Baker. The fact that they had pineapples everywhere and pineapple muffins, it took me like a year and a half to put before I'm like, oh, that makes sense.
It's amazing that they did the research to name it that.
Yes. Well, his story is not a big secret, but I'm super happy that someone took the initiative to actually honor some local history. And now we're going to talk a little bit more, something a little more super local history, and talk about Beauregard and Mamie Albury. And as I was getting set up this morning, or this evening when I came in, I heard a rumor that Beauregard still might be hanging around. Some of the people who work here think that they've heard footsteps, and someone saw some shoes. They may have looked like that. So I'm gonna have to. I invited him before we started. I invited him to come in and not to mess with the electronics. But if I get something wrong, to thump me on the back of the head. So if I do that, all of a sudden we'll know what happened. Now I believe this is probably his wedding picture, and he married Mamie Albury on July 2nd, 1910. But before we go any further with that, now Beauregard was born in Key West. His birthday is next week on July 17th, my wife's birthday is 17th, on July 16th, 1886. Now, his parents, William Dunham Albury and Mary, were living here. They had already left Key West, and they were living in a small community called Newport, which is just south of the Publix. Is that Mount 101 area on the ocean side? 5 or 6 houses there. And he was born in Key West, but when he was 3 weeks old, his mother packed him up and brought him, because even now, no one's really born up here. You go to Key West or you go to Homestead, some things don't change. And so he was 3 weeks old. They moved back up. He and his mom came back to Newport to live on the ocean. And a couple of funny, before he started school, he already knew how to fish and sail. And there were really 2 communities. There was Newport, and then there was Planter. Again, we talked about these being farming communities. Planter was a precursor to Tavernier. Harry Harris Park, Ocean Point Suites, kind of in between that area. It was called planting because it was a planting community. And that's where the school and the Methodist church was. And for the kids up in Newport, 8 miles this way, they would sail down their skiffs to school every day. Unless it was bad weather, and I have a hard time believing this. And I got a lot of these stories from him, interviews with him done in March 1967. He was 80 years old at the time. But talking about his memories and what it was like growing up. But he said that they would walk to school in Planter on a wooden path, like a worn path through the woods. Now this is a sketch done by Chrome during the railroad days, and the school was right here. And that star, to give you a little placement idea, that's Winn-Dixie. So we're talking walking from Publix to Winn-Dixie to go to school. He didn't have TV or didn't have anything, to play with. But that's a long day. I would imagine that if they walked, they would spend the week and then come back home on the weekend, which is what they did even in the 50s when Coral Shores didn't have a 12th grade. You would go down to Key West to finish high school, stay there during the week, and then come back on the weekend.
What is the source of that map? If I wanted to find that online, where would I look?
I don't know if it's available online.
Is it in a book? I mean, this is a railroad sketch done by William Crone when he was doing the right of way for the railroad.
So it's pretty annotated. They have a copy of it at the Keys History and Discovery Center. This is from Jerry Wilkinson's collection.
Oh, cool.
So they have it there as well.
Thank you.
Uh-huh. Now, Beauregard's dad, William, they owned a lot of property in the Upper Keys, on Key Largo. Basically, from Shell World to mile marker 100, that was all Albury property, ocean to bay. And one of the things that they did to make money is during the construction of the railroad, Beauregard worked with his father to supply, they had a contract with the Florida East Coast Railway to supply the railroad camps, 12 to 15 of the railroad camps with fish. They would ship twice a day or twice a week. And they would go catch fish. I'm going to read you a pretty cool little paragraph description of that. And they would catch the fish. Oh, I'll just read it. He doesn't. Beauregard does a better job of telling it than I do. So we used to fish a lot too. I caught from 1,200 to 1,500 pounds per day on a hand line. Sold them for 5 cents a pound to the railroad. They would furnish the ice and pay the freight. We packed the fish in burlap bags with ice for each railroad camp and marked the sack with camp numbers. This was during the building of the railroad. We spent 8 years fishing every day except Sunday. They would buy any kind of fish except stingrays and sharks. I caught Jewfish weighing up to 300 pounds. Yeah, I'll say with a hand line. Well, Cuban reels, that's a lot of work for a big 300-pound fish. Now, later, after the contract with the railroad for fish went up, Beauregard and his wife would go lobstering. And they would go at night in the skiff, and Mamie would hold the lanterns so they could catch lobster. It being lobster season coming starting next Sunday. Awesome. Yeah. My column on Thursday comes out. I talk about all that. You should have seen the crawfish in the mangrove roots along the shores. They were stacked up to 2 feet, one on top of the other. I've had them weigh 7 pounds. The whole shore would be red, 200 or 300 feet. One time I caught 2,900 crawfish with a small net. My father had a contract with the railroad to supply crawfish to Key West. The last season we worked for them, we shipped 5,400 pounds, even though the supply was depleted by that time. 1920s. The supply is already depleted in 1920s. Please open the season longer. That was the only year we kept a record. We found most of them on the lee side of Key Largo, Rodriguez, and Tavernier, wherever there was a mangrove shore. Nothing much on Dove Key. It's a lot of lobster in a single night or a week. Now, so Beauregard and Mamie Albury, married on July 2nd, 1910. They would have been with their 114th anniversary last week. Now, Beauregard had a lot of jobs. He was a sponge fisherman, and he knew these waters. He grew up here and knew the waters from here to Biscayne National Park, like the back of his hand. Or in his own words, as well as I knew the family garden, fruit garden at the house. He was also a commercial fisherman and a charter fishing captain. He also had the first car on Key Largo. And this is about 1920, and the road wasn't even built until like 1926, 1927. Now, we say he was a farmer, and we had a lot. The Alburys had a great deal of property, like we talked about. They had 2 farms. They had one in this area that was 14 acres long, 14 acres big, 14 acres, period. And in that portion of it, they had 10 acres of key lime trees, about 1,400 key lime trees. They grow about 1,400 trees. And they would grow them like from seedlings, and then he and a worker would pack them up and then go plant them in some kind of orderly area in the local farm. And then closer to mile marker 100, they had a 37 acre farm. Watermelon, tomatoes, onions, other fruits and vegetables. And there was some quote, he said one year he sold 1,400 watermelons to Key West for $35. I just bought like a quarter one for $5, for $4.95 at Winn-Dixie. So before they had the official road was built, 5 or 6, 7 years later, he had a road, a path, because like now, the railroad was the southbound lane. That was where the railroad was. And when State Road 4A, the first version of the Overseas Highway was built, opened to public transit in 1928, that's the northbound lane. Beauregard's little strip of trail was adjacent or paralleled the railroad tracks. And he would drive, he brought the car here so he could travel between his two farms with his workers and hauling things back and forth. Now that brings us to the house next door. Yeah, this picture's a couple years old, I believe. So they might not be here anymore. They couldn't have visiting that day. I know most of the histories say that the house was built in 1913. I've come across 1911. And as I was getting prepared for this talk, I was reading some new material. And again, a lot of that was based on an interview with him in 1967. And of course, he's 80 years old at the time. But he said that the house was built just after he got married, which was July 2nd, 1910. And the house took 6 weeks to build. Yeah. Hey, it's still standing. It's still standing. And he paid the carpenter $50 and room and board for the 6 weeks it took to build the house. And one of the unique things about this house, other than the fact that it's still here, and it's one of the oldest houses, it's the oldest house on Key Largo, and one of the oldest houses outside of Key West. The oldest house is technically the Adderley House in Crane Point, which is built in 1906. So this is just a couple years later. But unlike the Adderley House, this house is wood, and it was one of the very first houses to put screens in the windows. When he grew up in Newport, every night his mother would light a fire in a 5-gallon kerosene can, walk through the house to smudge it out, to get all the bugs out, and then close all the windows and close all the doors. And that's a really hot night. So it must have been nice to have this. And then I was talking to an old conch who said that growing up with the screens, while the screens would keep the mosquitoes out, not necessarily the gnats or the no-see-ums. So she said her father used to paint or line it with kerosene on the screen to keep the other stuff out. Not super safe hazard, not super safe, but and stink, yeah. But at least the windows were open. Now, one of the ways to combat mosquitoes, and this is just outside, called a mosquito pond. And this would be a source of fresh water because, as you know, after it rains, all the mosquitoes, big clouds of them, they can lay dormant for like a year or longer. And then when it rains, they erupt. But they have to have fresh water in order to breed, or order to lay their eggs, and they hatch, become wrigglers, those little snorkelers in the ponds. And one of the techniques is to put a little fish called a mosquito fish, gambia, into these ponds, which can sometimes eat like 100 wrigglers a day. So that was one technique to keep the mosquitoes at bay, was to keep their fresh water source supplied with these little fish to help eat them. And even today, you can call mosquito control, and they'll bring you Gambia to having your own little system. Now, one of the cool side stories about Beauregard Albury and the relationship between this property and one just up the road is there was, at this point, we're talking 1920, 1922, there was another school closer than Planter, and it was in Mandalay, kind of like where the old Island Grill was, across from Shell World. And this is a picture of the one-room schoolhouse. And because of the growing population, Beauregard deeded some of his land to the school board in order to build a 2-room Coral Rock school. This was 1923. And that's this building here. And there were 2 of these schools that were constructed. This one and the sister school, this was the Rock Harbor Grammar School, 2 whole rooms, no air conditioning, plenty of windows. And then there was the Matacumby Grammar School, which was built on the property of where Chica Lodge is today. If you've ever been to Chica Lodge, they have the old Pioneer Cemetery there. It was the cemetery, the school, and the Methodist Church all kind of lined up, 1, 2, 3. Of course, that was all destroyed in the 1935 hurricane, but the Rock Harbor School is still standing, sort of. This is it in the 1970s, custom cabinets, and then this is it today. Because you can still see the bone work there. Now, this was called the Garrett Observation Tower. This is 1938, around 1938. And this is at mile marker 98. Whenever I post this picture, everyone says, oh yeah, that's where Wyland's Wailing Wall is. Not really. Yeah. But this was the post office owned by C.O. Garrett, who was also a sheriff, who in 1933 had to have the sheriff. He was a deputy, had to have the sheriff from Key West come up because somebody was making a threat against he and his wife. But this was one of the original roadside attractions. And you could go up on the observation tower and kind of look around to see your surroundings. And that is what this area looked like. This is the northbound road. This is the original highway. And this is things have changed just a little bit. This is a 1938.
Is the next door building up there?
I don't think any of these buildings still exist. REEF would be, if we're looking north, would be this way a little bit. Now, this was from the Federal Writers Project in 1938. This is the description that the writer gave. A tiny village with a 30-foot observation tower over its post office. The tower is a square stucco structure anchored by cables to the bedrock. From its railed upper platform is a view of the Atlantic, Florida Bay, and the Gulf. Not sure I do Florida Bay and the Gulf at the same time, but come on. Eastward is the ocean shore where there are racks for fish nets. All around the tiny settlement are extensive lime groves that bear most of the year. To the west is a mango grove. Now, the pineapples kind of went out of fashion between 1906 and 1910. Why is the question? There were a series, 1906, 1909, 1910, there were a series of hurricanes that struck the area. If you've ever, after a hurricane strikes, when that storm surge comes up, everything green dies. All the grass is dead. So they call it a blight. Probably it's salted earth, all that salt water coming over. And also it's been 50 years of really a very minimum soil. So probably a lot of that soil was already, kind of used up. But one of the things that made pineapples successful was the limestone. As we all know, this is all an ancient coral reef. You can't dig very deep without hurting yourself, which is why you hire somebody else to do it for you. And but one thing that happens when freshwater or rain hits limestone is it produces phosphorus. If you ever buy fertilizer, one of the ingredients in fertilizer is phosphorus. So it's kind of a natural fertilizer going. But after this blight, the pineapples industry is gone. Also, by this time, because of these hurricanes, there is there's no more pineapples being grown here. And the Cuban pineapple market kind of erupts. And by 1908, I know the train doesn't reach Key West until 1912, but by 1908, there is daily railroad service between Miami and the 7 Mile Bridge, Knights Key. And at that temporary terminus, there are ferries that are docking at Knights Key, going to Havana and coming back, bringing, amongst other things, pineapples. So about 1909, the pineapple market is flooded with Cuban pineapples. Also, Flagler charged a cheaper tariff on imported pineapples than for the local pineapple growers. But they said, that's okay, we'll just start growing key limes, which were actually just limes in those days. They weren't key limes. They were just called limes. Key lime was introduced much later on as a marketing technique to get people more interested in our little variety of lime. Now, I just thought of this yesterday. There was a place in this area, I'm not sure where it was, called Max. And I remember this little car over here. And Beauregard Albury's, this would be a good time for you to intervene, my friend, in 1920, was a Model T Ford. And you really can't tell what that is, but it looks sort of Model T Fordish. And as I was putting this together for tonight, I remember this image in this car, and I wondered if that might be Beauregard's Model T. Thank you very much. Now, I also blew this sign up, and I'm going to read you the poem that's there. It's called The Flivver, Flivver. And that's kind of like a crap car. Now, the Flivver with piston rings, 2 rear wheels, 1 front spring, has no fenders, seat or plank, burns lots of gas and hard to crank. Carburetor rusted half through, engine missing, hitting on 2. 5 years old and in the spring, has shock absorbers and everything. Radiator busted, sure does leak. Differentials dry, you can hear it squeak. Wheels half busted, front all bent. Top it off, ain't worth a cent. Got lots of speed runs like the deuce. Burns lots of gas or tobacco juice. Tires all have been running on the rim, but she's a darn good flivver for the shape she's in. And it's for sale. So go see Mac inside if you want to do that. Now we're going to end up with Key Largo, the movie, which changed Rock Harbor forever. When this movie came out, there was no Key Largo, Florida. There was Rock Harbor, Florida. Key Largo was the island, but Rock Harbor was everything from Tavernier to Jewfish Creek. Now, when they say this, this is the birthplace of Warner Brothers' great movie, Key Largo. That's truth in advertising, because the Caribbean Club was the birthplace of the movie, but not for the reasons that they will tell you. Now, it wasn't filmed, there was no scenes filmed at the Caribbean Club. But the director, John Huston, and the writer, Richard Brooks, did come to the Caribbean Club and stayed there for a week or so. And he wrote the screenplay while staying at the club. They also did a little bit of gambling. Apparently, John Houston lost about 25 grand to the roulette and the card tables. Richard Brooks lost about $6,000, which is about how much he was paid to write the screenplay. And then, kind of mirroring the movie Key Largo, on the last day, there's a hurricane approaching, and the two guys were able to gamble before they left and make up at least some of their lost wages, and only lost a couple of $1,000s each. But the problem was that when the movie came out, it was so successful, people wanted to come visit Key Largo and send a postcard home stamped Key Largo. But there was no Key Largo. So the residents of Rock Harbor got together, passed around a petition to have the name changed from Rock Harbor to Key Largo, so that postal address would say, I was there. I was at Key Largo. So on May 31st, 1952, the Rock Harbor post office closed for the very last time. And in the morning, it reopened as the Key Largo post office, and now you can get that postal stamp that said Key Largo on it. This is where Napa is today. And this was like from there to Show World was all Albury property. Although he did sell to Flagler, to the Florida East Coast Railway, he did sell some of his land to the Model Land Company, which was a subsidiary of the Florida East Coast Railway, for $30 an acre. Doesn't say how many acres he sold, but that would have been for the right of way, and then for like the depots and stuff. But again, not sure how much. So with that being said, we can open it up to questions if anybody has questions. Thank you very much.
So the building that was the tall building with the lookout, it isn't the dive building. Where was it?
Just repeat.
Mile marker 98. So just we're like a 97 here.
Repeat the question.
We're not-
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. It's like, oh yeah, the sign in the back. Repeat the question. She's asking, where was the building? Where was that building located? Mile marker 98. So it would have been on the road side. So on the highway side, which is this side here, the northbound lane. So it would have been just north of where we are now.
Right. Absolutely phenomenal talk. I cannot believe I've lived here for 45 years and I am ignorant about almost everything you've said, in part because I have somewhat of a myopic perspective of the habitat in which I live. It's all on the ocean.
Yeah.
And something that you have brought to my attention that I thank you for, and have you ever heard the name Dr. Daniel Pauly?
I have not.
He is a Nobel Prize winning fisheries biologist, and he coined the term shifting baseline.
Okay.
And it applies,
That I've heard of.
It applies to fisheries. He came up with the name because in fisheries biology, it's a tendency for a marine biologist to look at their settings when they're a kid. And they look and they go, oh man, there's a lot of fish here. When they get to be 60 or 70 like me and they look back, man, things have really changed. That was my baseline here in the Keys when I first arrived in the early 70s. And what you said about the Alburys and the observations, the documentation about the abundance of lobster and fish, I've never read those quotes. And so I would like to invite you to speak again, and perhaps I would have an opportunity to inject some fisheries biology and marine science into this historical talk because there's an overlap.
Sure.
And I've got my paper here. I'm going to give you 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Christina.
bilingual, because a lot of these folks that were coming, these sailors weren't all English speakers, right? So if somebody's a successful wrecker, would that mean that they're also bilingual?
Thank you very much. Christina's asking if these wreckers were bilingual. I imagine there would have been a percentage of them that were used to going to Havana and dealing with Havana. But one of the things that was made clear in 1823 when after the Florida Territory became a Florida Territory, one of the things the government realized was there was a lot of money to be made on the wrecks on the Florida Reef. And prior to 1823, the wreckers were primarily out of Nassau, working for the English government, coming to the reef, taking all the spoils back to Nassau, or Spanish wreckers out of Havana, coming to the reef and taking the spoils back to Havana for Spain. So one of the first acts of government was because with the Adams-Onis Treaty, which is what gave this Florida, or the Florida Territory, East Florida, West Florida, to the U.S., also included the Florida Keys and the Florida Reef. So the Florida Reef has been declared an American territory, a part of American territory. So one of the early laws made by Congress was that if you are wrecking on an American interest, the Florida Reef, you had to bring that to a U.S. port of entry. And in those days, that was Key West or St. Augustine. And that precipitates why a lot of these Bahamian wreckers began to move to Key West and the Florida Keys, because that's where the money was. And I'm sure there was some overlap, and I'm sure there was some Spanish-speaking crew members on the boats. So I'm sure there was some, but you're also, a lot of these early wreckers were also New Englanders. A lot of them, a lot of the founding fathers from Key West are from, New York and Boston and New England, which is why there's so much New English architecture in Key West. So I'm sure there is some crossover, but I couldn't, 68% of the wreckers could speak French and Spanish. I have no idea.
Just one more question that I have. Do you have a hypothesis why this building next door is still here and all the rest of, maybe there weren't so many houses built then and there never were here, but why do we still have this house here and we don't have so many others?
So Jill is asking why the Beauregard house is still here, but nothing else remains. I don't know. I would imagine a lot of it's luck. A lot of it that the hurricane didn't get it. Probably a lot of it is just plain luck. There might have been some conservation, along the way. Someone who said, okay, this is an old house, we should keep it. But they moved out of this house in 1954 and moved to Tavernier. And I'm not sure what happened to it after that. But they were in that house for 44 years before they moved.
I love the idea that conservation was already to thank for keeping this place. And when you say feeling lucky, we feel very lucky that you are here tonight with us to speak to us about this. Let's have a round of applause.
Thank you very much.
And can someone take a quick picture so I don't forget? We have this lovely certificate of appreciation for you. Thank you so much. I usually forget to do this. Great. Everyone, please fill out the survey for us. Data is what helps. Oh, this is yours.
Oh, give that to me.
Data is what helps us do our work under the water, on top of the water, and our continued